community, and she needs and desires the company and the companionship of other women. And we love having the men in the room. So please do not read anything into that. But I was thinking about how gatherings of women, about women, is always something that not only should we strive for, but people thirst for and desire for. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we have gathered here today. I'm so grateful to each of you for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maya to tell us a little bit about how we're here. I just want to say one more time, thanking, I don't know when, Tamara and Abe for opening up their home for us and hosting this event. Particularly thinking about Abe's Abba, we just completed Shloshim for him, and when I asked Tamara if it was going to still be appropriate to have the event, because we had folks in their lives took this as an appropriate continuation of our memory and commemorating Abe's dad. And so I like to also think that we're gathered here in his memory.
So much for being here. Last Thursday was Thanksgiving somehow, and it's been a long week. And so I'm especially grateful in this very long week for you all taking the time, and to our panelists, thank you for all the effort that you put into prepare to have this very important conversation broadly about women in leadership. And more specifically, to give you some context, I'm Maya Bernstein, and I have the privilege of teaching and designing a leadership curriculum at Yeshivat Maharat. When we think about what it means to be a rabbi in general, but I think especially going into the 21st century, not only do we need to think about the halachic rigor and the spirituality and the religious knowledge and capabilities that rabbis need to have, but part of being a rabbi involves being a leader in the community and being creative and being able to help shepherd the community from 20th century Jewish life into 21st century Jewish life. We're still new to this century. And the needs of our community and the people in our community continue to adapt and evolve and change. And so the leadership that we need for that must be courageous. And I think when we think about the work of the Maharat students, there's an extra layer of courage that each of these women are bringing, specifically entering the rabbinate in the Orthodox world with all of the controversy that causes. And so it's been a real joy and an honor to work with the Maharat students to help them think through this question of being a spiritual leader as they prepare for their rabbinate. This year we're focusing on leadership as innovation, and maybe we'll hear from a student a little bit more later on about some of the work we've been doing, but thinking about what rabbinic leadership means in terms of being an innovator and trying to create new programs for the community. And we are thinking, although it may continue to change down the line, about leadership as change management and what it means to be involved in trying to shepherd communities through change, leadership and some of the technical tools it involves, what does it mean to run a board meeting and raise money, and all of the management skills that are involved. And then finally, leadership is spiritual activism. And I think Maharat sitting in the Bait and with Rabbi Weiss's legacy of spiritual activism, that's another important aspect of leadership. So that's sort of a snapshot of the leadership curriculum, which is still in evolution as we're learning as we go. And so to kick off our leadership curriculum and this year's focus on leadership, we wanted to include our community, and we wanted to start by thinking very broadly about what does it mean to be a woman who's going to step out into the world in a position of rabbinic leadership in the Orthodox world in particular, and what does it mean to be a woman and who's trying to exert leadership in the world in general. And in some ways, this is a very old conversation. We've been having this conversation as women for decades, if not longer, but it's also especially poignant today, and that'll be part of our discussion why we think this is especially relevant today. I also just want to mention, we'll come back to this later, that we can't ignore sort of the context of the hashtag #MeToo and all of the sexual harassment that has been in the news. It's a very much a part of our daily lives every day in the papers and on the radio. Briefly, Dr. Giti Bendheim is a psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice in New York. She was a founding member of the Orthodox Caucus and has served on the board of education at SAR Academy, the boards of the Furkov Graduate School of Psychology of Yeshiva University, Pardes, Ora, and on the JOFA Advisory Board. And she has also been an involved participant in Drisha and Matan. Ariela Dubler, the head of school at the Abraham Joshua Heschel School since 2014, is that right? Okay. Has a JD and a PhD in history from Yale and was on the faculty of Columbia Law School from 2001 until she made the switch to the Jewish professional world. Her research, writing, and teaching has focused on family law and history of marriage. And Rabbi Joanna is the founding executive director of Educational Alliance's Manny Cantor Center, an innovative multicultural community center and settlement house on New York's Lower East Side. She is a nationally respected spiritual leader and social activist. She received her rabbinic ordination from JTS, where she was a Wexner graduate fellow. So thank you all so much for being here. And I want to begin by asking each of you to briefly share what is it that impelled you to show up here tonight? Why are you sitting here on this panel, knowing how accomplished you are, how much is going on in your lives, right? Why is this important to you? So any of you can.
I'd be happy to jump in and say that, first of all, when Sarah asks me to do something, I do it. And I don't say that lightly because there are not a lot of people in the world that I feel that way about. I was really honored to work with Sarah in the earliest years of Yeshivat Maharat, along with Aaron and Rabbi Fox and others who are here. Out of my own deep respect and admiration for what it means to be a female religious leader in a world that doesn't always smile upon that, and to think about in the kind of lifelong work of how we use the privileges that we have, how we share them with others. I feel like people opened the path for me to be a rabbi, the generation before me at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and that has been a profound blessing to be a rabbi. And so I was always interested in how I could be part of opening that path for other women. I'm here in part because I have so much admiration for all the work that everyone at Yeshivat Maharat is doing, and for watching the evolution of this particular piece of Judaism, which I just admire enormously, and I feel very grateful to be brought into this conversation. So thank you for bringing me into this conversation. I think I'm here, this is like what I think about most every day, is how gender impacts my life and the lives of those around me. My kids assure me that not everything is a story about gender, but I think they're wrong. So, you know, eventually they'll see the light. I tend to think, probably to a fault, that most things are impacted by the way people see gender, and that has certainly been my professional experience. I went to college and law school and clerked for the same judge as my husband, and I feel like we're like a walking little experiment of two little mice in a, and I marvel continuously and have for a long time about the different assumptions that people make about us and have made about us along the way. And I'll say more about that later. And I'm also here because while I do think this is an old conversation in certain ways, I think it's an old conversation that still needs to be had. I have a 14-year-old daughter. I cannot believe I'm sending her out into a world, and two sons. I cannot believe I'm sending them out into a world where this is still a conversation that needs to be had. And I think it needs to be had in thoughtful ways that actually help people move it forward. When I was a law student at Yale, there was a panel of all the female faculty. And the question was, how did you get here? There were only about 8 women on the Yale Law School faculty when I got there. And they all told a story in which they had gotten lucky. And it was the least helpful panel I had ever been to. Because it's true that we're all lucky to get where we get. but none of the men at Yale Law School would have told you they got there because they're lucky. So this is an old conversation, but one I think that we can't have too often in ways that help people move things forward. That's why I'm here. And thank you for allowing me to be here.
So I'm here, first of all, because I really relish the opportunity to talk with you guys and you guys about stuff that really matters to me a lot. And I think a lot about female leadership in the Jewish community as a mother of daughters and daughters-in-law and granddaughters, to think about how are we going to make this work? How are we going to move this forward? And as I thought about it, I was trying to figure out, I'm supposed to tell you something about myself, so I'm trying to figure out what really galvanized my determination to really kind of do the work. And I realized that when I was in college, I decided that I was going to take a year off. And I took a year off and I went to Israel a very, very long time ago, before people were going to Israel. And I went to, I'll let you guess what this is because I think I would probably be not looked upon too favorably by other alumni of this institution if they realized what I was doing. A very immersive, very intense, very religious Israeli learning experience. And it was a program that was somewhat revolutionary at its time. And I completely gave myself to that experience. And I completely immersed myself in learning in Hebrew for the entire year. And I realized I emerged from there with such a sense of empowerment that I finally got the code. I figured out where the power was, what this was all about, how you can understand it and how you can use it, or how it is used. I wasn't sure at the time whether you could use it to move things forward. So my feeling is that very much like what's happening now in Yeshivat Maharat, that if you have these tools and you understand how it works, then you can really assume leadership. And my feeling is right now that this world is a mess. And I feel that this is a kind of a moment, a women's leadership moment. Our religious lives are not what they should be or could be. And certainly the world is not what it should be or could be. And I really feel that it's just not only a surge of women's leadership, of educated, thoughtful, capable women can pull us out of the difficulties, or at least help pull us out of the difficulties we find ourselves in as a religion and as a country. I think that the men, when they're left on their own, have certainly lost their way in the world, we might say, at this moment. And in our religious lives, I think we have already seen that the areas that affect women look different when men and women can think about them, each from their own perspective, in concert with each other. So, and I think it follows that it just doesn't, it no longer suffices. Perhaps we could say it's no longer necessary, or it shouldn't be necessary, or it should be less necessary for men to be making all of the decisions that affect people in general and women in particular. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Actually, Giti, as you were speaking, I was reminded of something that I hadn't thought about and probably had repressed in my memory, of being in a boardroom from a synagogue I was in California, meeting with some board members from that synagogue. And I happened to be the only woman in the room. We were in a law firm meeting it. And at a certain point, I made some comment in the conversation, and one of the men said, "Oh, that's why you're here. It's great to have a woman in the room. She keeps us on track." And I wasn't sure how to take it at the time. And then afterwards, I realized I'm not sure that was a compliment. Anyway, I wanted to ask this question that we've begun to talk about, which is, why is this question still relevant? And I was at a seminar a few years ago, in a pluralistic Jewish setting, and a man was telling a story about his son and being in synagogue with his son. And they belonged to a Reform congregation. And the son was watching the rabbi give her sermon and the Cantor take the Torah out of, the Aron. And this little boy said to his father, "Can men be rabbis?" So, here we are, right? We've come a long way. We've fought the good fight. Why are we still having this conversation? What's changed? What happened?
So I would just share my own family's version of that story, which is, I've lived on the Upper West Side for a very long time, and that's where I served as a congregational rabbi. And, my roots are very deep there. And my son once made the comment that like all we do is walk down the street and bump into women that I know, and they're all rabbis. And this is like his experience of growing up in 10024.
It's a happy place.
It's incredibly annoying, you know, when you're an 8-year-old. So I think, look, you don't need to like look much further than the news to see that this is not a world where women are thriving in the way that we deserve to be and the way we've worked to be. I think just to name the kind of shame and pain and brokenness that we are reading about every day, learning that women, our sisters, are being assaulted in their offices by men who have been held up as leaders in our country. Not only men who are leaders in our country, but men who are shaping and creating the narrative in which women and men are trying to exist. That helps us to know that something, even though I can call myself a rabbi and you can call yourself a rabbi or a rabbah or whatever, that like, that is like the tiniest little teensy tip of the iceberg. And that the really adaptive work of creating a society where women and men can lead together and can thrive as the people who we are is very, very, very far off. We are really, really far away from that. And so I think the conversation that I want to make sure we have is about what are the strategies that women leaders can bring, what are the tools in our toolkits that we need to have in order to be the leaders that we dream of being, knowing that we are living in a world that is so unprepared for our voices, for our stepping out, for our taking up the space that we are put on this earth to take up. But what I don't want to talk about actually is how we change ourselves in order to somehow fit into a model that we have been shoehorned into, not for our own good, right? Not because anyone's saying like, Yael, you know, come and be Yael. Like, it's like, Yael, like be Yael, but like a little bit less, you know, or more that way or less that way. Like, that is not the conversation that we can have anymore, right? I think if anything has come out of the last months and weeks, it is that masculinity is in a crisis. It is in a crisis, right? And that we have the opportunity now to step up and say, okay, this is actually how people are going to treat each other in a workplace. This is actually how women need to show up without fear of God knows what. And so in that way, the conversation is a welcome one, again, with the caveat that it not be about how we shoehorn ourselves into some large L leadership model that is not one size fits all.
So I'm wondering, as a follow-up to that, maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion around what are some strategies, because that's tough, right? I think about partly this phenomenon, you know, the analogy that comes to mind is the phenomenon of white flight, right? When upper white class families left cities when minorities started moving in. And I feel like you see that phenomenon in certain areas of the professional world in general, and the Jewish professional world. It's very stark, right? Men used to be the majority of teachers in our schools, and now, I mean, you know, there are like a handful, maybe, of men working in elementary schools. My mother is a pediatrician, right? So when she was in medical school, she was one of, you know, 3 women in her medical school class. Now, oh, pediatrician, that's women's work. So I'm wondering if, really, and like, what's going to happen, right?
With the salary to match.
Right. That's right. Whereas you can go be a surgeon, and that's still a boys' club. So I'm wondering if there's some sort of phenomenon in, you know, Jewish education and then in the rabbinate, where if we let women be rabbis, suddenly that's women work. That doesn't, you know, I guess my grandmother used to go, this is terrible, but maybe, is it Hitler, who talked about women in the Kuchen, Kirche, and Kinder, right? So like that's where women belong, with the children, in the church, and in the kitchen. And so if we're saying religion and religious leadership is now becoming women's work, then, oh, it's just women's work.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think women having assumed clergy responsibilities have changed what the show feels like in ways that might make people less comfortable. People feel that it's changed the spiritual level, not across the board, but sometimes, and maybe fewer. It may not be the same boys club atmosphere. It's different, and I think that really might contribute to men not being all that interested in being part of it. So I think that's actually an interesting point.
Okay.
I'm gonna
Okay,
think about it a little more.
Great. So Ariela, I'll ask you my next question. In a recent New Yorker article by Sheila Cole-Hatker entitled "The Disruptors."
Wendy has some big feelings on this article, I should warn you. we're gonna make some space for it after I hear it talking about it.
This is an article from a recent New Yorker about discrimination in the tech world in particular. And he claims that little has improved over the years. 2 recent studies found in 2016, right? I guess this is one of the boys' clubs. Only 7% of the partners in venture capital firms
As opposed to all the non-boys clubs. Right. Maybe nursing.
Right.
Sorry.
Don't
be deterred. Don't be deterred.
That's not true. There are a lot of men nurses.
Right? There are.
I know.
Yep.
It's a good job.
Okay, come back, I'll finish the quote. And just 2% of venture capital funding went to female founders. And she writes about a woman who was seeking venture capital funds for a company that was actually aimed at early career women, to support early career women. And she was trying to raise money, and she found that male investors, this is a quote, couldn't conceive of a business that catered to women who worked full time. They would ask multiple times whether her customer base would disappear once women entered their 30s and started having children. Many of the investors' wives didn't work, which they cited as proof that this theory was correct. So Ariela, in your research and in your work both in the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, I'm curious about your thoughts regarding how, is this a unique challenge facing women in the workforce in general? How is it manifesting itself in the Jewish world in particular, and what are the dynamics between those two realms?
I tend to think that workplaces are workplaces. Now, I went from a particularly quirky work. I went in a lot of extremes, from being a full-time academic, which is its own quirky workplace, to being in charge of a school. So it's overdetermined that my experiences have changed. But I would say across the board, being a professor, being a lay person on boards in the Jewish world, while I did not have a Jewish professional identity, and now being head of school at Heschel. I mean, I think there are certain things to be attuned to counter some of those phenomena. I think that there's a long history about which I had been writing a book before I decided to run a Jewish day school, of using the fact that women get pregnant to explain why they can't do a whole bunch of things. So in the 19th century, they called it the maternal difficulty, right? Women couldn't be in certain roles because biologically they were predetermined to not be in those roles. That started with pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and I don't know how it goes on forever after that. But that was the theory. The theory was it was biologically predetermined. To me, the biggest place to fight the inequality of workplace is actually in that realm. I think it is about not only what goes on at the workplace, but sometimes what's harder for us to talk about, which is what goes on at home. To me, in all of the professional settings that I've been in, one of the greatest obstacles to female leadership is the assumption that they're going to do more of the caregiving work at home. Interestingly, while many parts of this conversation, of the Me Too conversation, of many of the conversations we have about female power are incredibly class-based in certain ways, right? So far, the Me Too conversations have been about very elite women. The Silicon Valley conversations are about very elite women. Assumptions about caretaking at home is one of the few things that brings us together in America across class. And, right, across class, people assume that women are going to do more of the caretaking at home. And I think one of the largest will and should, yes, that's correct. And I think that one of the greatest impediments to women's leadership is actually make the sacrifices that are entailed to do 50% of the work at home, because it is really hard to lead at work and be fully responsible for all the responsibilities at home. This is where I have to say, I don't know how many of you have read Lean In. I know Lean In gets a lot of, attacking and praise. This is where I think Sheryl Sandberg has it exactly right. If you want to be a leader and you want to be successful at work, you need a partner who is going to relish that, support it, and put the time into what it takes to make that possible. It doesn't mean it works every day. I always tell the young women who are working with me, there's a day seared in our marriage's memory where I was supposed to give a talk at the University of Chicago at 1 p.m. and I was supposed to be on an 8 a.m. plane to make that happen. And there were a couple of sick kids, and Jesse, my husband, is a lawyer, and he had somewhere he had to be. And you know what? I didn't make it to the talk at the University of Chicago. And you know what? Life went on. I cried a lot. I felt really bad about myself. But those things happen, and they happen because life happens. However, if you are balancing work and home, and we no longer call it the maternal difficulty, we call it work-life balance. To me, the greatest leadership challenge is finding someone, if you have children, if you have other responsibilities, to do half of that care, and to not assume that you're going to do it yourself. Beyond that, I think you got to find strong mentors. Strong mentors tend to be men because that's the kingmakers. So you got to find strong mentors who are self-consciously mentoring women. And I think you have to be really attuned to the comments like I can't remember what he said in the boardroom, but I could write a book. I was going to, about all of the crazy comments that people have made to me. I was recently in a meeting where someone told me, to soften my edges. And the test for me, no one was there. And the test for me, I have a little test in my head. Has anyone ever told Jesse to soften his edges? So I'm going to go for no. I corroborated that when I got home. But those little comments, which I think you have to catalog and work against, are the ways that workplaces, and I think it's Jewish workplaces and non-Jewish workplaces equally, reinforce the set of roles. I could go on forever, but I'll stop.
Everything that Ariela said just really resonates with me, and I want to point to just this issue of all the comments, because I want to say the hardest hour of the week as a rabbi is Kiddush. Kiddush is brutal. It's just people coming up to you going you look really tired.
Can I take you shopping?
Yes, I hate your clothes. By the way, I have lung cancer. You can't imagine what is going on in that city. And people are sharing incredibly important, painful things with you, and telling you that they don't like your skirt, and where's your husband? Why doesn't he ever come? Is he traveling still? What does he do? And I think that it's really imagining I'm a little bit oh my God, right now, I can't believe I lived through that. But I think the comments are really hard because they're like chisels, right? They're soften your edges, stuff that really is our own vulnerabilities that are being and men also experience this in the pulpit, I want to say as well. My male classmates from JTS, we have a little closed Facebook group, and it's across the board in the Jewish community. We're all family, so there are no boundaries, all that, right? People can say whatever they want to you because you're their nephew or their uncle or
I bet no one has to take them shopping.
Oh, yes, no, people, oh, yes, yes.
All right.
Oh, yes.
I'm feeling better about the state of the world already.
Nobody asked you if you were pregnant, though.
But I think
The comments that I find most pernicious actually are the comments, and this really came out in the work that I was doing around gender equity. Like I would go talk to men in the Jewish community and I would say like, you know, what act do you want to take on to support shared leadership in our community? And the first thing I would hear about was like, well, my wife is this or that, or she stayed home to the kids. And I'd be like, okay, like I understand you have a wife, you guys have made decisions, and I'm talking to you professional to professional and saying, what is the work that you want to do to help build a vibrant community where men's voices and women's voices are sharing the kind of opportunity for leadership? And so what I realized in those comments was, I mean, I'm sure there's a psychological term for this, but like in that moment of feeling so threatened by my leadership or by my request that people share that burden with me of creating a community that is more equitable, the insecurity came up about like, well, my house looks like this, and so I need to tell you that, right? Like, my wife doesn't work, or my wife stayed home with the kids. And all of those choices like make sense for people, and God help any of us for getting through this life in one piece, because it's actually really hard. But with those comments they're meant to kind of, I think in that moment, sort of remind me as female leaders that we're not on an even playing field.
passive aggressive is my side.
I mean, I was going to come back to this later, but since we're talking about it, I came from a wonderful Maharat class this afternoon, went home for, an hour to make dinner, to meet up with Noam and come here. And I walked into the house and literally every single one of our 5 children started holding me, pulling on me, and crying, hysterical crying, each with his or her own major crisis. And what I've found is that—
Thank God I have a work event tonight.
I'm out of here, I'm not. But in all seriousness, right, I feel, and I struggle with this all the time, there's this inverse relationship. The more successful I am at work, the less successful I am at home. The more successful I am at home, the better I feel as a parent and as a partner, as a homemaker, as a modern Orthodox Jewish woman who actually invites guests for Shabbat and cooks food, right? The more successful there, the less success. And it's just this constant feeling of I'm failing. I'm constantly failing in some area. Am I alone?
It's only you, Maya.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, next question.
I think it is the classic, like you're doing everything at 70%, right? So it adds up to 140%, but 70% kind of feels kind of bad if you're someone who likes to do things at 100%. And I think, so I think 2 things. I like to think that my children, and this could all be self-justification, but I like to think my children benefit. I certainly benefited from having a mother who was passionate about her career. And I think that my children benefit from having a mother who is passionate about her career. And I try to bring them in. I mean, now I've really brought them in because I took over their school. But before I gave them no choice but to be brought in. Like, I would try to really bring them in to my professional thought and life and passions in ways that made them my intellectual partners around that. But yeah, it doesn't always work.
I think that's a really important thing to do. Like I was thinking, like sometimes you become so impinged upon by your leadership responsibilities that you realize that I forgot to make lunch for this kid, or he doesn't have any socks in the laundry, and then you just tell him to step up barefoot. And I am trying to make change, and I'm doing something important, and you take one for the team, or feel part of this effort because it's important. And I really think it's important to process that with your kids. Nobody's perfect. There's a lot of stuff to do. Sometimes you have to do it without socks. It's not.
So I think, you know, to the point of the importance of a partner and finding a partner who's 50%. I think there's also work that we need to do as women to, and I'm speaking to myself, but to lower the guilt factor. You know, so your kid doesn't have socks. I literally forgot to buy clothes for my baby for our oldest child's bar mitzvah. Like that morning, I laid out clothes for everybody. I was like, I forgot. You probably should wear clothes. And like,
good idea. Not the only idea.
I think there's really something to that like the tremendous burden, I think, of our leadership, particularly in the Jewish community, where there is such a kind of proud tradition of what it means to make our homes and make our homes places of love and warmth and guests, is that, I mean, I'm one of the only observant Jewish women in my entire workplace, and I think the people who work with me think I'm crazy. Like, I really do. I think like when I'm like, oh, I stayed up late, I was cooking because people are coming over, they're like, look at me like, what are you doing? And like, I could never explain to them how important that is to my own work in the world, right? And that I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't truly, spiritually, like the emet, think that the world is a better place because I occasionally stay up late on a Thursday night and cook a lot of food. It's hard to explain, right? But I really agree with what both Giti and Ariela, our children get to live in the world that we're trying to build, right? Which is a better world, right? We're all in this because we actually think that our communities are better with our leadership. And like, my daughter's having her bat mitzvah in a couple of weeks, and like I'm thinking, oh, she is growing up in this community full of like everyone she knows is like an activist and a scholar and a rabbi and a person who was working in international development and whatever. And like, are our lives crazy? Like, yes, my husband works in international development. Like he's like in Cambodia half the time, right? It's like nuts. But like, that is her, that's her world. And that was not my world growing up. And that's what the itch was in me to make more of that world. But I think that our guilt is so pernicious and it's so punishing. And I think that's work that we need to do together in community, right? To figure out how we free each other up from thinking we're holding that burden. Am I the only one? Like, no. No.
I also think you can be unapologetic at work about the fact that you have responsibilities that aren't at work. And that includes, you know, ailing parents, which I've had, sick children, which I've had, years of infertility treatments, which I did. Like I think that life has demands, and modeling that at work is risky sometimes. And I will candidly tell you, I didn't do it before I had tenure at Columbia, and I regret it because I think I lost an opportunity to teach my students something that wouldn't have impacted my career and might have impacted theirs. But men aren't afraid to do it, in my experience. It's not all men, but most men that I have worked with have not been afraid on the occasional time that they have had to. That's not true at Heschel. At Heschel, they parent publicly and regularly. But at Columbia, on the occasional moment when some man had to do something, it was like we were all supposed to bow to the, you know, amazing babysitting, to the amazing thing that he was doing.
Are you finding that to be the case with millennial couples now? I'm seeing this whole sharing culture changing. I mean, I hear like, we are now going to change the baby diaper. Okay.
Let me also say people have family commitments who do not have children. And that's also important to remember.
That's
like
true.
Most people should have commitments outside of their job. And we can also be a part of that.
Yeah. I wonder though, in a shul, like how much permission spiritual leaders give themselves for that. Like I have found working in an organization to be much more normative, to like have life outside of work, and like we've worked very hard to make this like discussed and discussable, and my agency and whatever, like we're really good on this stuff.
That's not my experience. That we're really good on it. I mean,
in my
I'm happy it's your experience,
in my agency,
but it's not my normative workplace experience.
But I would say in my shul, when I was the rabbi, I had a harder time claiming that time for myself. And again, I need to like kind of press rewind and wonder, is that about me and my like being, you know, in my 30s versus my 40s, or, you know, feeling like I needed to prove myself all the time, or is the nature of the job in some ways, is it reliant on this myth that you are available all the time? And I really hold that as a question, actually, in synagogue life. I don't know. And I think it's, again, worth really bringing people into a conversation around that, who are willing to be vulnerable and honest about what they gave up if it wasn't that way, and what are some ideas to forge ahead a kind of healthier, normative culture of work and also life outside of work.
Okay, this next question, Giti, is for you, and it's framed in terms of raising children, but I think it's really a question about mentoring the next generation and those coming up. So there was an op-ed piece called "The Bad News on Good Girls" in last Sunday's New York Times. Jill Filipovich talks about how the subtle and often unconscious difference in the ways that we raise girls and boys affect their trajectories in life. For example, girls are more likely to be praised for being good, while boys are commended for making an effort. Girls are generally raised to be more emotionally intelligent and verbal than boys. Dads sing to their daughters more than to their sons. But with boys, dads are more physical and more likely to roughhouse. The implication of this is that it's the adult women who end up serving as the caretakers for the men, both at home and in the workplace. And finally, she claims that one of the most important ways to move forward at this moment is to simply be aware that these assumptions and prejudices exist, and to deal with them head on instead of pretending that they aren't there. Here she claims daughters of conservative men are at a particular disadvantage. 3/4 of Republican men say that sexism is mostly a thing of the past. So given your experience in your work as a psychologist and with your deep knowledge of the Jewish community and having raised a family, how should we be raising our girls and boys? And I would add that we, in some ways, maybe more in the Orthodox community, are at a similar disadvantage. The entire system in which we operate, and children are seeing those patterns and copying those patterns. How can we raise our children to let our women become leaders?
And thinking about this question, I thought mostly about how we can raise our children to become leaders, how we can be conscious leader producers. And my thought was that, and again, I agree with you that this is not only about children, this is about modeling in the community. I think it's really important to commit yourself strongly to the path that you believe in, and then invest yourself, and if you have a family, and your family in that. I grew up as a very good girl, but I grew up in a family, when I was growing up, my parents poured all of their energy into the nascent day school movement and into the new school in Pittsburgh that they were starting, which is where I grew up, and in the brand new state of Israel, which sort of animated every fiber of their being. And I was very, very, very aware of it. And I grew up in this environment of activism and passion and engagement. And I was very young, and it really stayed with me. And I really feel that it's an important investment in your kids' future to be passionate about something. And you can't tell them about it, you just have to be it. I have this funny memory in the olden days. It's very funny given all the sexism and other things about women that we're talking about today. But I remember that there was something very anomalous and funny called Tag Day in Pittsburgh, which was a day when everybody's mother dressed up in their nicest suit and their highest heels and went out to the equivalent of Fifth Avenue with like a tzedakah box for the school. And they stood there collecting money on the corner, and anybody who gave money would get a little flower to put in their lapel, because of course they had a lapel. The women didn't have a lapel. And I remember that was like just the most exciting day of the year. And you know, similar to that, I could seriously, it's
time to be your campaign.
It's hysterical. And I remember, like, getting out of bed and sneaking downstairs to see who was at a meeting in my house and, you know, all that exciting stuff. So I think it's really important for kids to see that people have agency, that work doesn't get done by itself. People do the work, and the people who do the work get to vote on how that work gets to do things in the world. You know, so seeing your parents really involved in that, or seeing people you care about very, very involved, really can inspire that kind of involvement. And I think that getting involved in something and taking on responsibility creates an obligation, but it also, and more importantly, creates power. And I think it creates power to exert influence, and it creates power to make change. And if kids see that, then they've really learned a lot. One of the other things that I think it's really important to do in the religious life of a family. I'm talking now from, I guess I was going to say I'm talking from the modern Orthodox point of view, but I think I'm talking from any committed point of view. I think it's important to strike the difficult balance between modeling compliance and non-complacency. And very, very often they're contradictory, and I think it's really, really important in terms of engendering leadership. You know, modern Orthodoxy is a lot about rules, but I think it's really important for kids to see that while emphasizing disciplined practice, we're also honest about things that feel wrong that need to be remedied, and the Aguna situation comes to mind. Kids should see that not all is well in the adult world. And just because you're all grown up doesn't mean everything's fine. And it's okay, and even deeply right, to fight for possible change and to be bold and step out a little further, in the SAR's words, like beyond your comfort zone, to do what needs to get done. In our particular family, this is sometimes veered into in the direction of cynicism, especially when our protracted efforts don't bear fruit. I think this is an occupational hazard. It doesn't happen in all families. But, you know, I've had the great fortune of having a husband who's, speaking of partners, who's very, very supportive of the things that I'm interested in, whether he's interested in them or not. And I think that that's a very, very important thing also for kids to see, that you don't have to agree on everything. And you can be separate and supportive, and you can argue about things and do your work in the world. Finally, we're talking about inviting people into your home for meals and stuff. And I think that inviting people into your home is a fantastic way of exposing your family to, you know, if you invite like-minded, passionate people, then they feel like they're part of an exciting team. And if you invite people, and I think this is maybe more important, who have different points of view from yours, it engenders curiosity. It lets them get to know the kinds of things that they're interested in and that they can be enthusiastic about, and what they are willing to put themselves on the line for. And I think it's important to show your kids that it's important to put things on the line, to put yourself on the line for things. So those are some of my thoughts here.
I wanted to say something, Giti, about what you just said, which is with all of that, and I really believe that deeply, and I'm watching my children grow up in that. It's also the case that there have been times when I'm not present, or not as present as I would like to be or think I need to be. And the pain of that absence is real. It's just real, and there's like no explaining it away. And I think it's almost like that's where the spiritual work comes in, of just sort of like looking at that tragic gap between like what you want and what is, and going like, here we are, learning that like life is imperfect, and just like being in that in a way that doesn't try to explain it away. Yeah. And those are gifts that we can give to other people also as spiritual leaders, right? Not to be like, it's all well and good because now they're learning to be activists or like whatever. It's like, honestly, when your kid wants help with their homework and you're not home, or like you stopped nursing before you wanted to because your job's crazy, like those are really painful, really difficult things. And that then show us like the depth of the life that we're living, like Latov and Lara.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to some questions from our wonderful audience, and we have a first question from a Maharat student. It's a bit of a plan. I
Sure. Well, first of all, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming and sharing of your wisdom and life experience with us. As Maya alluded to before, we are at the end of a short journey at Yeshivat Maharat, which started with us interviewing a bunch of women who are here today about their own spiritual experiences as women, mostly in the Riverdale community. And what I think was really fascinating and that we all sort of observed afterwards was that a lot of these women had never been asked before about their spiritual experiences. And even in this conversation, you spoke about spirituality. You're also the rabbi of the panel. But then I wonder whether in all the talk and all the struggle about how do we be like powerful women in our homes and in our work, like where's the soul to be found in that? And like we can talk about that, all that work and all that struggle as being like the holy, but is that experienced as such? And if not, like what's the support that we can provide to women who are going through that so that they can feel like the work that they're doing and the 70% in both ways feels like it comes together in some sort of like Torah infused, like rich Jewish whole. Small question.
All right. Well, I'll offer a few thoughts. I don't have an answer. If anyone has an answer, you should go first. I don't have an answer. I'll give you a couple thoughts. Shabbat for me is a big part of that answer. Sorry. So I was just going to say that, and I have one of my dearest friends who I check in with most days is a woman rabbi at Central Synagogue, Angela Bookdahl, and I marvel, like we share these conversations really almost daily, and I marvel at how she can do it and not have Shabbat as a non-work day. For me, when Shabbat starts, like it is 25 hours of a spiritual experience because of the work week that my husband and I, and now my children as they get older, like all have. And the forced arrival of the end of work and the gift of the unavailable time. And I am married to someone who did not, in his early years of life, keep Shabbat, and we've been married a very long time. So he's kept Shabbat for a very long time. But watching someone start to see timeable that I had always appreciated as unavailable is like, has made me appreciate that gift of just having it be unavailable for work. For me, it's, for me, as Rabbi Heschel wrote about it, like it's largely about marking time and making time, whether it's the few minutes I spend davening each morning, which are often few amidst everything, or Shabbat. It's about preserving time, and time, importantly for me, where you're really unavailable. From the kids, like if it's davening, from work, if it's Shabbat. That's like where it sits for me.
I think working on Shabbat is really, 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 really hard. And I had this experience like the first Shabbat after I stepped down from my congregation, and we were like in our house, and I just had a baby and had another little kid, and of course things were probably crazy, but I was lighting candles, and I looked at my husband, I was like, Shabbat is the greatest. And like,
as it turns out.
Yeah, he was, yeah, so you've been saying to many people, like over many years. And so I think that like, given the reality that many of you will be working on Shabbat, not only will you be working, but it will be a day of stress, like of like big events in people's lives, and like really showing up in a way that is Lichvod Shabbat and also like, honoring the community. I think it's so important to think about other parts of the week when you do something that isn't just learning for your Devar Torah that you're going to give, right? Like maybe having a chavruta that you are never going to use that material to teach. You are just there with your chavruta to be together, or something, or some kind of tefillah that is like maybe really different from the tefillah in your shul, where you can, it's just for you, and that it isn't like, let me get this in so I can spit it back out for other people.
Akin to that, I was thinking, in our community, there are so many things that are routine and rote, like davening is, you know how to do it and you zip through it, etc. For me, it's always very, very, I would say, spiritually enriching to stop and have a different take given to me on a given tefillah. I mean, you know, I don't know, thinking about Asher Yatzar in a focused way, or really even thinking about a story that you've done a million times in the Chumash, looking at it again and having somebody give you a unique kind of interpretation. I think sort of looking at the routine in a new way, for me, is a spiritual experience.
Can I add one final thought? Because I hope this will be all of your experience, since you're all at Maharat now. Having had a job that did not feel spiritual in any way for the major part of my work life thus far, and now being in a job where it's not that everything I do feels spiritual by any means, but the overall project nourishes my soul in a way that my prior job did not. And that is a gift of the highest order. And as you think about choosing jobs in the world that you're in, like, I recommend you aspire to a job that nourishes your soul. It's not going to nourish your soul every minute of every day. Or, you know, more power to you if it does. But it's a real gift to have that spiritual element in your daily work.
Can I just piggyback on that? And also, I'm not on panel.
No, you're allowed. You're on the panel now.
When some of the students, I was listening in when some of the students were interviewing over this weeks ago, and I thought it was really interesting that the definition of spirituality was just varied, actually. And so I heard Joanna talk about spirituality as learning for yourself, or you know, having an experience, or you know, tefillah. But I think actually, just like Ariela was saying, I think that spirituality doesn't have to be like a religious moment, but something that nourishes you. And I think about that exact same language. And for some people that might be learning or something religious, but what is it? What is it? And you have to consciously think about it. What is it that nourishes you? Is it, and that's what you have to seek out. You know, is it laughing with somebody? Is it going to a movie? I mean, what is it? Is it cooking?
Chocolate.
Is it
Friends. Find strong friends and rely on them.
I have a question and a comment. I might be the only person in the room who runs a tech venture. So that question, my response, and I'm only saying it because I might be the only person who runs a tech venture, is that where the money, when there are no, and in all of my years, so I've been on my current venture for 5 years, and all the years I've sat across the table from one woman VC. The analogy in the Jewish world, because obviously I'm on a bunch of boards and starting things, whatever, where does the money come from? And if you have this great idea for a school to train women, right? Who's going to give the money, right? Who's going to give the money? Well, we got it, right? Oftentimes the philanthropists also, I don't know what the stats are, but that's where it gets locked up. The good thing is in the not-for-profit world, actually most of the money is directed in the not-for-profit world. So that's one of the things I think of, and I'm happy to talk about your article. Here's my question: public policy, loosely defined public policy, meaning it doesn't necessarily have to be federal, state, city, school policy. In order to do this successfully, we need partners at home, spouses and whatnot, to help us. And then there's the institutions and the community we live in. So when the school only emails the mom about your daughter going into a new math group, or the Board of Ed and the school only email the mom because of some IEP shenanigans, my response is always CC chat. Please, luckily Chloe has 2 parents. Please respond to both. But I'm, you know, so as for in an institution, in a school, in all these environments, how do we set environments where that, because
you got to be super explicit. So, you know, we tell our development committee that runs our capital campaign at Heschel, and what I've told every board I've ever worked with, and it's much harder now that people have cell phones, right? So it used to be,
you call the house, now
you email them both. You don't make any call. If you do not have a home phone, you do not make any call to a Heschel family until you have emailed them both to say, I'm looking to talk to one of you about the annual campaign. Like, our nurses know very well now that, like, you don't just, no one should just email a mom. But you need to make these policies super explicit. How do you do it?
Do you have explicit
policies? Yeah. We like sit down and we talk about them, and it doesn't mean it always works 100% of the time, right? And then you talk about why it didn't work. And mistakes happen, but I think you have to set super explicit policies that correct for the assumptions people make about who makes different kinds of decisions when those assumptions are so deeply embedded.
And I did do that in the personal realm too. Our daughter now in 6th grade going to a million bat mitzvahs. One mom set up the Google group and the WhatsApp for the bat mitzvah carpools. I said, Mom, hey, get on that Google group right now. And I said it to them also.
I mean, Jesse Furman, my husband, has been class parent every year since the poor guy organized the bar mitzvah gift. See, like, if there was a volunteer to be had, he was the volunteer. And I will say that one of my pet peeves is, like, how amazed people were that Jesse, who is a federal judge and takes care of lots of complicated things, managed to also produce a Hanukkah gift for our kids' teachers. Like, it was not that incredible, but the kudos, like, I reached the anger phase. But it's not so amazing that he managed it.
And that's also part of what we need to change culturally, though.
That's what
we need to change
and
the response
and
to the men doing if Noam takes our children shopping, people will throw flowers at him. You're the best father on the planet.
So, but you need policies around those things, and policies have to be set around fundraising and around who we assume is doing caregiving, and they have to be very, very explicit.
I want to piggyback on the anger that I'm really enjoying here, because I feel like I'm hearing a lot about how to create partnerships, how to expand things so that men come in with the same responsibilities women have. I'm not, how would you address sort of the flip side of, as a woman in the workplace, I'm willing to pull back from this assumption because it's the kind of assumption that is made about a man with no family, and that's sort of historically how it's been. But, like, as a woman with a family, who cares about things outside of my job? How do you sort of say, actually, no, I'm not going to participate in this. I'm going to make this space for myself. Because that somehow feels harder than, like, saying, oh yeah, my spouse is going to be class parent. Like, because, like, once you've done the very hard work of finding a partner who supports you, like, that's the hard bit. So, like, once you have that, where do you go?
So I think you choose your jobs really carefully. Like, that is the lens to bring to all kinds of interviews. Like, if you're working with a partner in the clergy who works 7 days a week and works 24 hours a day and tells you that, like, he understands that, like, it's going to be different for you and don't worry about it, do not go there, because it's actually not going to work. It's not going to work because if real work is defined as 7 day a week, 24-hour a day work, then no one else can match up to that. And the anger and the resentment and the belittlement and, you know, all of that becomes like the daily experience of your labor. So I think I've always said this, it is easier for women to be in charge than it is to be not in charge. I have like the weird experience that for the first time in my life, I actually have a male boss. It's an adjustment for both of us. And I don't think that that relationship could work if he weren't the person that he is, who's just really enlightened and, you know, just not typical, I think, in our communities. But my classmates who went to be assistant rabbis in synagogues with workaholic male senior rabbis who were totally defined by their jobs, to a person, were unsuccessful. Not in the way they showed up to the community, but in the way they showed up to themselves. And they always say they left the job, and I always say, no, you were ejected from the job, because actually people can't work that hard, and it's not productive. It's not productive for our communities. It's like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think of yourself as a really precious resource that like cannot be diffused or wasted in the world by living up to a structure that is really not going to work for you. It may be that it does work for some people, in which case, great. I have female colleagues also who have a different relationship to work than I personally do. But I think especially in a synagogue, like do an audit of that synagogue and do not go near it if you feel like it's not a place where you can be who you are.
Just one caveat on that is I don't think most people work 24/7. And I think that the time off tends to be less visible when certain kinds of people take it. So I wouldn't want to fully, I think that's a challenge. I'm not saying there aren't easier places to work or harder places to work, but everyone should get to have a balance. And not everyone has a balanced life. No one's working all the time. And when that not work time is more and less visible, I think often depends on who the worker is. Yep.
Wendy. But I was really taken with the story, Ariela, that you told at the beginning about the panel with the 8 female law professors who felt lucky and how that felt extremely unhelpful to you. It seems to me that a lot of what happens often is that it's difficult for women to create like the proper and like reasonable expectation of like what it is that they should be doing and what it is that like they should be able to get out of the situation. And I'm curious because I can imagine sitting there and I can imagine hearing that, but I'm curious whether you have any suggestions about, right? Because I think a lot of us do sort of feel lucky to be doing what we're doing, and I think you're right that it's not a helpful way to think about what one does. But like, how would one go about creating like the right set of expectations?
So my own view is that men in general, again, like I'm talking about the workplaces I've been in, and predominantly my time in academia and in like the legal world in New York, I think men in general under-recognize the luck and women in general over-recognize the luck. And I think successful careers, successful lives, successful accomplishments always, in my view, involve tremendous amount of good fortune and luck. And you have to put yourself in the position that's going to let that luck pay off. And I think that my male colleagues have always been much more self-conscious about the instrumental pieces that you have to take care of so that when the lucky moment comes, you're there and ready to capture it, and much more willing to share those instrumental pieces of advice with their mentees than has been my experience with super successful women who are much more likely to shy away from a story in which they were super instrumental and sort of planned out each step of the path so that you could be in the right place when all the stars have to align, in my view. It's never fully in your control, but there's a lot of agency that success involves. And I don't think we should be afraid to like embrace that agency and help other women take the steps necessary to succeed.
Do you think that, sorry, go ahead.
Well, just also, I guess the other part of it that struck me was just that there is a way in which I think women often kind of feel grateful for whatever it is that they happen to have, and that I think prevents us from kind of expecting more. And it seems like often whatever your expectations are kind of determines like what you want to be doing, right? If you expect to be doing something more, you expect to be given more opportunities, like then you get them, and if you don't, and you just kind of feel happy and lucky to be where you are, then you kind of stop where you are.
In part because power is often performative. So, right, and I think that counters gender norms. Like I think women too often think if I act more deferential, people are going to like me more.
Correct.
And actually,
and they will, actually.
Sometimes, sometimes they will, but you won't. But and like it's a double bind, right? Because if you're too, right, we all like. I don't need to script this for you, but I think that that women need to be encouraged to act in powerful ways that reinforce people thinking they're powerful. And some won't like it, and some will like it, and some of it depends on who's in the room. Are there more men, women? Who are they? Like, but power, I think, is definitely a performative thing. Like you have to act it to have it.
I think what you were getting at, Wendy, is something to do with, you know, I'm curious about the woman's inner experience. Does she experience herself as really having been lucky, or does she experience herself to have strategized to get where she got, but she doesn't want to acknowledge to other people that she did that, and therefore she says that she's lucky? So I'm curious, what's the more, or both?
Right, because the fact is, like, people don't like when women are really ambitious and, you know, call out their own accomplishments. Like, it's a little bit like, you know, look at the world we live in. And so there is a constant calculation to being a female leader of like making sure that you're putting yourself out there, you're putting your effort out there, you're making it clear that you're, you know, deserving of the role. And also that you're like in what, and I talked about this yesterday, like in that funhouse mirror of like, okay, I stepped out, I'm going to step back, I stepped out, I'm going to step back. And it's a constant balancing act. And I sort of feel like every time I start to think like, when am I going to like sort of be at the end of that, it makes me feel really sad. And when I just think like, okay, it's a piece of the work in the same way that like juggling the house and the work and all of that is also just, it's a piece of work that's going to accompany me my whole life.
Okay, so we're almost at the end. So Erin, do you want to ask the last question?
Thank you. The assumptions of the conversations we've been having tonight, which have been so wonderful, as usual, have been that work and life are separate domains. And yet the work that many of us in this room do or will do have much blurrier domains, right? Where work and life actually come together, whether it's on Shabbat for rabbis, whether it's working in a school with your own children there. And so outsourcing is not really the solution, and it's not even the model that some of us even want to put forward in the world. We envision a world in which work and life actually can be in the same room, might even be in direct conversation with each other. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to your own experiences of having life, by which in this case means children, but not only that, but ways where your life actually encroaches upon work, how you handle that, what kind of modeling you actually want to put into the world in that respect, what kind of value system you want to see with regard to work and life in an actual balance.
I graduated already.
I think people are trying to call it work-life integration language, because you're not supposed to be separate people, you're supposed to be a whole person, you're supposed to be.
So I spent most of my professional life very separated. I had like a identity as a law professor. I did Jewish communal work, like it had no overlap. And I eventually wrote a little bit about my own personal experiences, but mainly like it was totally separate. There were real upsides to that. There were real upsides to that. My professional identity was like very neat. And the rest of my work felt, and it was not just kids, it was board work, and it was like a whole realm of my life that was separate, and was nourishing in a different kind of way. My work was also nourishing. The scariest part for me about becoming head of school at Heschel was like my whole life integrated in one fell swoop. And suddenly I had no boundaries. Like I now parent publicly and work at home because our Shabbat guests are like people who are part of our nothing and separate. And there are challenges to that for sure. You know, I definitely parent very publicly, and I work at home. I like to think that that's a good model to share, and that I benefit tremendously from that integration. And most days it really feels like it is. And I hope that it opens up room for the people, both who I work with and the families in the school, to like have that access to the different parts of my life in a way that leads to generative conversations that hopefully will get at the issues that I am most interested in changing in the world.
I would add to that I think there is something about being the spiritual leader of a synagogue to be really aware of, which is when you start getting put on a pedestal for who you are as a spouse or a parent, and how confusing that is with your own inner reality of those relationships, which are, you know, God willing, full of blessing and also always complicated and fraught. And so, sorry?
And ungraceful.
Yes, oh my gosh. And yeah, I just found that really hard. Like I found that like my impulse is like for such honesty and such transparency, probably too much, and that it was hard for me to be thought of in this way of being up there, both because I didn't like that, and also because I was so aware of like the pain and suffering in so many people's lives that I was working with, and I felt that it was in some way like a kind of friction against that. And so in some ways it made me want to not have like my beautiful children at Shul on Shabbat, and my, you know, male husband, you know, who has an exciting job and, you know, went to Harvard, like, because I felt again that sense of like, I don't want to be, I don't want to be the object of someone's displaced envy for what they believe is going on in my life, without the complexities of everyone's life.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for including us in this.
I want to end with just leave you with a little word of Torah, since we had talked about one of the kernels to pull out from this is give yourselves little gifts of self-care and spirituality and Torah. And this is a piece of Torah that I think Noam actually learned from Rabbi Shelley Lewis in Palo Alto. And there's at the end of Shmoneh Esrei, at the end of like the very last bracha, v'nafshi ke'afar lakol tiyeh, right? My soul be like dust to all. It's sort of an interesting little statement. And Rabbi Lewis interpreted it as, if you think about somebody walking in the dust, they leave footprints. And what if we thought of that little phrase as everybody who I encounter, right? Let me be like dust and let them leave their footprint upon me. And you have left your footprints on us. We're grateful, and it's your footprints and our footprints that are going to pave the way to the world we want to be in.
Good night. Shabbat